to our Ukraine Solidarity Lecture. We're going to be here for about an hour talking Ukraine, talking philosophy and theory, and hopefully coming up with what might be a critical approach that nonetheless feels like it is in the spirit of our time. My name is Julian. To my left, we have
I'm Jeneline. Good morning.
Jeneline. And Jeneline edits the transcripts of all of these classes. Jeneline is our in-house editor over here. So big thank you to Jeneline, who edits these lectures and who posts them for our Patreons on Patreon.
Yeah.
No, for our patrons on Patreon. There you go. There's never been a point in my life at which the word patron or Patreon has like rolled off the tongue. Exactly. Before we begin, we want to say that this is going to be a 1-hour lecture dedicated to the war in Ukraine. We're going to continue to talk about Ukraine and what's happening there. We're going to try to do so from a philosophical, theoretical perspective. Hopefully that will be enlightening for you. We know that we have Ukrainian students. We know that we have Russian students. We know that the streets of heaven are too crowded tonight, as Jet Bartlett once said in the West Wing. And what we will do, hopefully, is that we will try to provide, if not a solution, at least some solace in what is a very difficult and troubling time by means of thinking the world. I still believe very, very strongly that in times of great need, in times of great crisis, what can sometimes bring more than you might expect is to actually engage critically with the world around you. And I say that not just to our Ukrainian and Russian students who, of course, have not chosen the times that they are living in, but to all of those who are watching today who would like to find some solace together with us in thinking the events as they are unfolding. And this is something that the philosopher Hegel wrote about quite frequently. He said that a philosopher can never know what will happen in the future. A philosopher is not a prognosticator. A philosopher is somebody who has to grapple with the limitations of that which can be thought in the present moment. And so a philosopher finds themselves, and anyone who's philosophically inclined finds themselves in the difficult predicament of caring enough to look around them and to try to find the clues of the future that is folding from within the present, but also not caring so much that they would impose their views or their beliefs or ideology or hopes and fears for the future on others. And so it's finding what you might not call a neutral stance, but a kind of objective engagement that the philosopher has within the paradoxes and contradictions of the present. So what we're going to try to do in more simple terms today is we're going to try to find some solace in solidarity in thought. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yeah? Okay, excellent.
I'm going to let you take a sip and invite those of you joining us. Yes, greetings to Brazil. Thank you for letting us know where you're coming from. You knew I was going to ask because we always like to see where our community has spread and where our students are joining us from. So thank you so much for starting your week with us. Thank you especially to our patrons who continue to keep this project on the road, as it were. We are deeply grateful that you support us in trying to bring complex and interesting thought to the confusing times that we all live in. So greetings to Montreal, and Ecuador and Portugal. We're so glad to have you joining us.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining us from around the world. It makes us incredibly grateful and happy, and it is so incredibly humbling to know that you're sharing this space with us today. We feel very, very grateful, especially to all of you who are joining us live today. That is really the ultimate gift. Okay, so hello to the Philippines, hello to Maryland, hello to Nijmegen. What is it that students here? And Ukraine. Good evening from Lviv in Ukraine. That's incredible. I hope to keep that in mind, that we are also speaking to Ukrainians here today. So I want to start with what to my mind is the elephant in the room. This is something that I've been grappling with a lot in the past couple days. And it's a question I think that many of you have been grappling with, which is the West, and by the West I mean Europe, I mean the United States, finds itself in a situation in which it has to ask itself whether it wants to accept the existential, political, military consequences of its beliefs in democracy, of its belief in sovereignty, of its belief in freedom of speech, of its belief in the dignity and individual sovereignty of mankind. And Jenlene was pointing this out to me the other day, that question, as big as it seems, currently seems to present us with only two options, neither of which are very appealing. On the one hand, to not commit to Ukraine, to not commit to Ukrainians, or to commit in a small way, but to not be willing to see it through. The other choice, to escalate the conflict in Ukraine, to stand with Ukrainians, and to risk World War III and potential detonation of nuclear warheads by Russia, perhaps by the West. Now, Jenlene said this to me the other day and it made me laugh. Jenlene said, with choices like these, who needs choices? In other words, we find ourselves with what is essentially a false choice. A false choice between standing up for Ukraine and a false choice between watching the end of the world unfold. But it's very interesting to me because I feel like within the past week, we've seen a fundamental shift within the way in which the West conceives of itself. And what I mean by that is this. Slavoj Žižek, who you probably know, has frequently politicized the Hegelian idea of the beautiful soul. And for Hegel, the beautiful soul is somebody who essentially makes a demand that cannot be met. And Žižek has said that most liberals today in Western developed nations, relatively affluent liberals, even leftists, perhaps people like ourselves, succumb to a kind of beautiful soul mentality by which they make what are essentially hopeless demands towards political leaders, expecting that those political leaders will not act upon them. And most liberals, most leftists are perfectly happy to sign a petition, maybe even to go to a protest, thinking to themselves that ultimately nothing will happen. In other words, from a psychoanalytic perspective, there's a hysterical relationship between liberals and leftists towards the powers that be. That as long as they perform a moral condemnation of events, that leaders will be the rational ones who say, well, we can't intervene. And everybody goes home feeling better for it. Those in power remain in power. The people on the street go back. And yet, something has changed. Something has changed in the past week by which the beautiful souls of Europe and America are suddenly actually demanding change. The petitions, the efforts, the demands, the lamentations on behalf of Ukraine are not performative. In a very striking and unusual way, people are actually demanding that the West step up. People are actually approving of a kind of action that usually would be tacitly accepted that it wouldn't happen. And so something changed within the past week whereby many people actually want us to stand with Ukraine. And this is where I want to be very clear that as leftists, we have to be careful not to succumb to cynicism. And I feel this very strongly myself. My initial response to the shift by which people actually want change in Ukraine, actually want us to stand with Ukraine, actually want us to wage war together with Ukraine side by side. My initial skepticism as a leftist was to say, well, what about Syria? What about Georgia? What about Crimea? What about all these instances in which we were beautiful souls who complained and yet expected nothing to change? Why now? Why is it now that we are actually demanding that we take a stand? That was the cynic in me. But let's remember that cynicism is the primary mode of being within late-stage capitalism. That cynicism is what actually prevents the world from doing what is right and necessary. that most of us adopt the shield of cynicism that protects us from the consequences of the contradictions in our own thought. In fact, the contradictions in our very way of life. And that cynicism isn't so much a lifestyle or an attitude, but that for most people, cynicism has become a carefully honed coping mechanism with a world that seems to never live up to our expectations, and yet to always live up to our worst fears and doubts. And so within the past week, I found myself being cynical. I found myself thinking, why is it that all of a sudden we're standing with Ukraine when in so many instances there has not been a massive consensus shift? And then I started becoming critical of the fact that European leaders were rapidly passing military spending budgets without any due democratic oversight. And before I knew it, I found it hard to stand with the people of Ukraine because I'd become so mired in my own cynicism. And yet, it occurred to me within the past couple of days that what we have here is a post-liberal moment. What I mean by that is a moment in which the West, Europe and the US, is no longer cynical. A moment in which the US and the West are not using democracy as an opportunistic ploy to invade other nations for their resources. Remember, when the United States went to Iraq, Iraq was touted as being akin to the Nazis. John Bremer, the US envoy at the time, said that Saddam Hussein was the closest to Hitler that we had seen in the modern world. And in fact, the pivotal moment, and you could say the pivotal mistake in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, was the so-called de-Baathification of Iraq, the process by which everyone who had been a member of the Baath party, the ruling party, was no longer permitted to function as a meaningful citizen in that society. And the de-Baathification policy was touted under the narrative of being a denazification program of Iraq. And it occurred to me that this kind of cynical historical comparison by which the United States was pretending that Iraq was somehow a Nazi state is closer to the Russian historical illusion apropos Ukraine than what the West is saying right now for Ukraine. In fact, we find ourselves in, again, a post-liberal moment in which we are standing with Ukraine not because democracy and freedom are convenient, but because for once we actually believe in them. In other words, here we have a war that is being fought not under the cynical guise of bringing freedom to the world, but of taking a stand for what is actually a bastion of democracy and freedom in the world. You were going to say something, by the way.
Yeah, no.
Because I have a longer argument that I want to make.
Yeah, no, a couple of things. There were just 2 points that I wanted to make. I think that it's really nice to hear you elaborate on this position, because I think that part of what your and my initial reaction was informed by our experience, mine as an American and yours as German, in terms of how dangerous nationalism and patriotic militarism are in a society. And I think that we have a reluctance to say this is the euphoria we should follow in any situation. I think that we're allergic to that, and I think that we wanted to bring attention to that dynamic in this situation. The second thing is I absolutely agree with you, and I think what's been interesting about this conflict is that it's been framed in terms of it's about NATO. It's about these countries either becoming NATO members or becoming in some way partial NATO members, or European members of the European Union, etc. But I think it's important to note that what Putin really needs is his own buffer, not just of states that are non-NATO and non-EU, but states like Belarus that are not free, that are controlled by Russia, and that don't present a model of liberal democracy.
Sure.
And that is the threat. That is the existential threat to Russia, is a neighbor that does have free press, that does have elections, that does have these values that we hold dear.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I want to go back to the original question that I started this lecture with, which is, if we do really believe in the West, if we really believe in the idea of freedom, individual sovereignty, democracy, if those are more than just convenient concepts that we use to justify our own foreign invasions and interventions, if we really believe in them, what are the consequences of that belief? What are the price that we're willing to pay for that belief? And what I want to say about that is this. Cynicism, as I said before, has become the predominant attitude necessary to cope within a late capitalist world, in which ideology is no longer about false consciousness. In other words, ideology is no longer about participating in something as if you didn't know better. Instead, ideology today is about finding yourself almost forced to participate in a society whose fundamental principles you no longer believe in, whose fundamental motives you've come to suspect. And what's remarkable about the past week is that the motives that we wish would underlie our society, the principles and ambitions and higher ideals that we imagine for ourselves in the West following perhaps the fall of the Berlin Wall, are being put to the test. And the cynicism that usually sustains us within capitalism, that allows us to function in a broken world and a broken society, has now reached an existential moment in which we either cynically continue to disavow the slow erosion and the gradual decline of our belief in something better than what we are. Or, on the other hand, do we do the seemingly impossible and we say we want to draw the consequences of our own desire to live in the kind of world we believe could be possible? And of course we can say that Ukraine is not the perfect vessel for this desire and this ambition and this hope. Zelensky, for that matter, is not the perfect icon for this ambition and this hope. There are little ways in which we can cynically undermine our own beliefs, for example, in Zelensky, by saying, well, the company that he was a part of found itself listed in the so-called Pandora Papers, that Zelensky had offshore bank accounts that were being invested into million-dollar London properties. Perhaps Zelensky is just another crooked politician. There are ways in which we can succumb to that cynicism. And yet the irony, and the properly Hegelian Lacanian irony, is that we love in Zelensky what is more Zelensky than himself. In other words, Zelensky has found himself in the, frankly, quite unfortunate position of embodying quite literally the hopes and dreams and aspirations of the European continent, and perhaps to a lesser degree so, the American West. I mean, not West, but the American, you know what I mean, North America. And it's interesting to me because I'm not a big Nietzschean, but you know that Nietzsche has the idea of the last man being the man who has succumbed to a kind of apathy, a kind of world weariness, a man who, and mankind, who has succumbed to the inevitability of their own impotence. And famously, infamously, you could say, Nietzsche contrasts the last man to the Übermensch. Of course, we immediately have to point out that the Nazis, of course, used the idea of the Übermensch to invect against the supposedly degenerate, weak, last man that had to be fought. It's a ridiculous binary. It's one of the problems with Nietzsche. And at the same time, in Zelensky's manner and in our rapid idealization of Zelensky's position, we've realized that we've all become the European last men. That we all believe in a West that we no longer think exists. That those of us who ought to be the most engaged with the idea of a West that stands for emancipation, sovereignty, freedom, democracy, that through the pain of our own knowledge, and remember, not all knowledge is suffering, ignorance is bliss, through the pain of our own historical realization of the way in which our own history has proven time and time again that imperial and colonialist expansion has been waged under the auspices of freedom, democracy, etc., that we've secretly stopped believing in the idea that one could actually stand up for freedom and democracy. In fact, this is how I know that we're in a post-liberal moment, because Jenlene and I were watching a TV show on HBO called Peacemaker, probably the first truly Brechtian superhero. And Peacemaker's slogan is, "Eat peace, motherfuckers." And we are now living in a West in which all of us know the manner in which the United States has waged war under the banner of bringing peace to the Middle East, under the banner of bringing peace to the world. Peacemaker is not just an ironic superhero. Peacemaker is also a cynical superhero. And what I mean by that is the character isn't ironic or cynical. The character truly believes. What makes Peacemaker funny is his fundamentalism, his genuinely authentic belief. And there's a moment later in the series in which Peacemaker starts to wonder whether it is indeed moral to be indiscriminately killing people on behalf of peace, in which his sidekick or whatever, Vigilante, starts severely questioning the sadness of Peacemaker's predicament when he loses the absolute authority he had. Peacemaker is a television series designed for an older audience that has become cynical and that finds entertainment in its own cynicism. Irony, after all, and I want to say this for our younger students who are probably more aware of this than anybody else, irony is a generational flaw. We are a generation of ironic thinkers. We have become uncomfortable with sincerity because we know the dangers of appearing to be sincere in a world in which sincerity has been used against those who are deserving of it. What I mean by that is that we've come to grow up in a world, if you're a millennial, you've lived in a world in which every time that you've adopted a sincere belief on behalf of something you hold dear, a people close to you, a community you love and support, that you have found that historically that sincerity has been used against you. And so we've become suspicious of sincerity. We've become guarded against the pitfalls of our own desire to be true to our word and to our intentions. And we find ourselves again in a post-liberal moment in which we now have a refound sincerity about the necessity to stand with Ukraine, a necessity that puts us in the impossible position of having to choose between a world at war and a world living in a kind of cynic detachment in the afterglow of our own narrative about democracy and freedom. And for some of us, perhaps myself included, I believe we were already living in this afterglow. We were already living in a time in which you could no longer use the word democracy without putting in quotation marks. You could no longer use the word freedom without feeling like you wanted to cringe. And yet that cynicism that we've embodied doesn't have to be the cynicism of those who follow us. It doesn't have to be the cynicism of the next generation. There is something to be said for a sincere existential grappling with what do we stand for in the West, and what is the price that we are willing to pay for those beliefs. Now, Zizek has a joke about belief that I quite like. He has a joke about the way in which belief can itself become cynical. And it's about a man who has a horseshoe attached to the front of his door. And this man is a supposedly rational thinker, somebody who doesn't believe in superstition, certainly doesn't believe in lucky horseshoes. And one of his friends comes over for dinner, and he sees the horseshoe hanging on a nail above his door. And he says, "What are you doing? Why do you have this horseshoe? You don't believe in that kind of stuff." And the man says, "Well, I've been told it works even if you don't believe in it." Of course, that's the cynical belief of capitalism. We've been told it works even if we don't believe in it. We've been told that we can continue living in the kind of world we're living in which nobody fully believes in democracy and freedom anymore. That we can all exist in a kind of twilight of our own skepticism and cynicism, and that this will be enough. And yet we all know that we're facing the inevitable consequences of our own inaction. A kind of inaction that fuels the global action of a world living in the throes of late-stage capitalism. And so we find ourselves in the very peculiar and precarious position by which inaction is a kind of action. And action is actually pulling the Benjaminian brake on the train of history. That by standing with Ukraine and taking a leap of faith into the unknown, and the genuinely dangerous unknown, and the existentially uncertain unknown, that we actually pull a brake on the world that was continuing without us being able to stop it through our own idea that we were not a part of it. In other words, the war is presenting us with a kind of existential question, which is, do we genuinely believe in the West? And are we willing to accept the consequences? Or have we already succumbed to our own apathy and cynicism, and what we no longer believe in is the idea of the West? Instead, we simply believe the idea of a capitalism that churns on no matter what. The fundamental decision we're going to have to make within our lifetimes is the decision whether we would like to live in a Chinese system of consumer access and capitalist consumer freedoms, whilst living without the guarantee of individual sovereignty, of freedom of expression, democracy. Or do we choose to live in a world that is fundamentally more precarious, perhaps even more violent, certainly less affluent? And do we find it in us to actually take a stand for the conceptual freedoms that we used to think we held so dear? And again, I want to stress that Ukraine is not the perfect test case for this. It's like having children. There's no perfect time. There's no perfect time to defend the West. In fact, the very narrative of defending the West is ideologically suspicious. But there is a time in which we realize that we embrace the idea of a belief that isn't cynical. A belief that isn't, I believe in this because I've been told it works even if I don't. But that we have the properly invested belief in something that requires a radical leap of faith on our behalf. And that's a much more dangerous proposition. It's a much more difficult proposition. But let me make another argument for my case that we are living already in a post-liberal world. And by post-liberal, I don't mean the world that Putin imagines, a world in which liberal democracy is indeed simply a cynical guise that we've adopted in order to bolster our credentials as a superpower. What I mean to say instead is that the very language of political correctness has already been embraced by the least democratic parts of our world. I was reading an interesting interview in The New Yorker, where a New Yorker journalist had gone to Afghanistan to interview Taliban leaders. Very brave reporting, very difficult and dangerous work. And one of the amazing things about what the Taliban leaders were saying is they were presenting themselves, believe it or not, as being liberal rulers. The Taliban said, in our parliament in quotation marks, we have quotas. For example, the ethnic minority that we tried to commit genocide against, at least one of their people has to be in parliament. And the West doesn't even have quotas. So look at us. The Taliban are the leaders of liberalism in the Middle East and tolerance. The Taliban have also instated a rule by which many women are sent to work, and they sign in and then they go back home. In other words, the Taliban women get to work. The Taliban are perfectly aware that the United States waged war in Afghanistan partially under the auspices of liberating the women of Afghanistan. That in the United States, liberals, leftists, and feminists alike argued in favor of the war on humanitarian grounds. And yet, since we all know that Iraq and Afghanistan were not fought genuinely, sincerely under those reasons, the Taliban have simply adapted the cynical position by which the Taliban is now supposedly the truly enlightened, progressive force in the country. The idea being that before the Taliban there was chaos, that women were oppressed, and that the Taliban have liberated women to assume their proper role in society. Think about the way in which neo-Nazis today and white supremacists use the language of identity politics to frame their radical political position. Which is to say, in the battle for identity, it is us whites who are the true minority, the true oppressed people. And that to be a neo-Nazi is to give voice to the voiceless, the genuinely oppressed minority. Of course, this is a horribly cynical take in which the right have adopted a kind of identitarian politics to suit their own purposes. We can make more examples. For example, the way in which those who are against abortion today, who threaten the individual sovereignty, emancipation, and freedom of half of our population, argue that this is something that is being done not pro-life, but instead that it is for the individual rights of bodily sovereignty. In other words, that the narrative by which your right to choose suddenly becomes the right to no longer have an abortion for your body. That the language of the left has been adopted by anti-abortion activists. Look at the way in which anti-vax activists today use the language of bodily autonomy. We've seen myriad ways in which the cynical stance towards left-wing and liberal ideas about individual sovereignty, about freedom, identity, have been co-opted by some of the least free, the worst, the most radical people on the planet. And that there's been a steady drip of apathy that has grown within us as we see that the things that we believed in and that we wanted to fight for, individual freedom, individual sovereignty, emancipation, equality, freedom of speech, have become labels and catcalls, or whatever you want to call them, identifiers, red flags for the exact opposite. Adorno once said that one of the worst things about being alive in the 20th century was to see everything you held dear come to stand for the opposite. That if you Google freedom of speech today, you are more likely to be directed to a radical right-wing website than to someone who's actually trying to secure freedom of speech. That if you Google bodily autonomy today, you're more likely to end up on a Reddit thread for anti-vax or anti-abortion protesters than you are for transgender rights. That the language and the narrative and the concepts that had been used by the left have succumbed to a kind of cynicism in which they've seen to become the opposite. And that is the result of living in a time in which you and I both grew up, in which we realized that ideas such as peace and ideas such as democracy and ideas such as freedom were being cynically and opportunistically manipulated by world leaders to generate popular support for wars that didn't need to be fought. And yet today, Isn't this exactly what Russia is doing? Russia will not allow its people to accept that the war is a war, that the war is instead an intervention designed to protect the Ukrainian people. Again, think of what Adorno said when he said that the painful reality of living in the 20th century is to see everything come to mean the exact opposite, that we become buried in layers of contradiction. How you could argue and convince your population, or at least segments of your population, through propaganda, that bombing your brothers is what is liberating them. In other words, eat peace, motherfuckers. Just yesterday, we saw Russia announce or offer humanitarian corridors that would lead back to Russia. That's not a humanitarian corridor. That's like those underground tunnels in New York in which all the livestock would be led to the butchers. Tunnels that we don't see when we walk around on the street. What has happened is that Russia wants us to be stuck in a narrative of a clash of empires. And yet nothing could be less true. Russia does not have an ideologically, solid position, let alone valid one. Russia is existing in a post-democratic, post-Soviet, corrupt, criminal, unfree society. A zombie nation in which its population is being held hostage to the whims of a very select and small group of people. Even Putin's upper leadership doesn't want this war. So this is not a clash of civilizations. If we give into the idea that this is the final contest, the culminating chapter of the Cold War, in which we have the Russian and the Slavic way of life versus the Western way of life, we've already lost. That is the temptation, is to succumb to that overarching meta-narrative, a meta-narrative that serves only Putin alone, a meta-narrative which his own people don't believe in. There is no support for the war in Ukraine. There is only the propagandized support for the idea of a liberation of Ukraine. And what that means is that we can choose to be cynical. We can choose to respond to the war by saying, it's just Ukraine. In fact, Obama, in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, Obama was in a room with his security advisors who were asking him to take charge, were asking him to send a message. Problem was, the United States couldn't actually deliver financial sanctions. It took them almost a year. They weren't prepared. And so what Obama said at the time, he said, quote, "Tell me one stake we have in Ukraine." And his advisors couldn't provide any. And that's the question we find ourselves in today. If we are the so-called realist liberals of the Obama era, the rational, objective, non-political thinkers of the Obama era, then yes, we have no stakes in Ukraine. And yet, on the other hand, all of our stakes are in Ukraine. What is happening in Ukraine is an existential moment in which the West has to decide once and for all whether it still believes in what it is, or if we succumb to a cynicism and an apathy by which we no longer believe it. And what I want to say again is that from a personal perspective, my entire life has demonstrated to me the dangers of waging war under the guise of freedom and democracy. that the very idea that you would stand up to defend your nation was, to my mind, so suspicious as to be borderline fascist. After all, you and me, we are the inheritors of a generation who experienced World War II, who experienced the myriad ways in which narratives that even have a kernel of truth to them can lead the world into a frenzied, irrational abyss. Case in point, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was not fair to the German people. The Treaty of Versailles was punitive, it was vindictive, it didn't allow for the dignity or even the possible recuperation of a German sovereign nation. And yet that doesn't mean that Hitler was right. In the same way that just because the United States have waged opportunistic and cruel and vindictive and imperialist wars across the world, that doesn't make Putin right. It doesn't mean that we have to side with the reckless, violent, neo-colonialist expansion of a Russian regime that is already in its dying breath, just because we know that we have done it too. And vice versa, as I said in a clip the other day, just because we stand with Ukraine and stand against Russia doesn't mean that we have to stand with everything the West does. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical of the military spending that is happening right now that doesn't actually serve to help Ukraine. When the German SPD Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced an open-ended 100 billion euro fund, which by now open-ended means it's 110 billion euros. That's another 10 billion within the past week, if I'm not mistaken, to modernize the German army. This is not too little too late. This is too much too late. This doesn't help the Ukrainian people. What we have to be worried about is the European continent seeing Ukraine as an expendable partner, not a necessary ally. What we have to worry about is a kind of discriminatory and perhaps even racist narrative by which the people in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans are considered less worthy of saving, are considered somehow not quite European. It's a terribly painful paradox and contradiction by which our very emphasis on the Europeanness of Ukraine may end up meaning that we don't stand with Ukraine, that we've regained our own belief system at the cost of Ukraine. And if you followed my lectures, you're aware of the idea of the vanishing mediator. And what I want to say is that Ukraine cannot be allowed to become a vanishing mediator for the rediscovery of Western purpose. In other words, if it turns out that the West only believes in democracy and freedom at the expense of giving up on Ukraine, then what is that freedom worth? And so what I started this class with was the question: does Europe really believe, not in itself, does Europe really believe in freedom? Does Europe really believe in democracy? Does Europe really believe in the individual sovereignty of nations? Or do we give in to our own cynicism? Our own cynicism that points towards the myriad ways in which, as quote-unquote Europeans, we have abandoned said beliefs. For example, when we conveniently bribed Erdogan into making sure that Syrian refugees would not make it to the European continent. For example, when the United Kingdom suggested that it had to militarize its operations against the little dinghy boats that were trying to cross the channel. A war of a defenseless UK against 20 people in a rubber boat. Or do we say we're cynical about the way in which we didn't actually make a fuss about Georgia or about Crimea? We can be cynical about the way in which the European Union squeezed those countries that we're less affluent on behalf of the more wealthy nations. We can be cynical about the ways in which German politicians sold out their own energy policy to Russian buyers. We can be cynical about the way in which London has become a global hub for dirty money. We can be cynical about so many different things that have happened in Europe. And yet the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we succumb to our own cynicism, where we no longer allow ourselves to believe in the possibility that there are wars that can be just? Or do we instead argue that the net result of our cynicism, which to a large degree is not based on prejudice, but based on historical fact, should lead us to believe that cynicism is our best option? And like I said in the beginning, with choices like these, who needs choices? I refuse to advocate for military escalation. And I refuse to advocate for the abandonment of Ukraine. You could say that that's no choice at all. It's an evasion. It's an evasion of the responsibility of what it means to say that this is what matters. And yet, what I want to argue in this quote-unquote lecture, which perhaps has been the worst lecture I've ever delivered, I cannot tell, is that when I went to the symphony yesterday in Spokane, I was very surprised that the symphony decided to forego its usual ritual, which was to play the American anthem before every concert. Yeah, they do it everyone. Oh, only for some?
Only at the first concert.
At the first concert of every season, they play the American anthem. I thought it was like a sports game. Instead, at the symphony yesterday, they played the Ukrainian anthem. And I was surprised because the entire symphony hall stood in attendance of the Ukrainian anthem. And the cynic in me immediately thought, this means nothing. This means that we feel better about what's happening in the world, but it doesn't matter for Ukrainians. And when I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that it's precisely those actions that seem to mean nothing, that collectively mean something. And that even though we don't know where we're heading, I believe it's very, very important that we've had a collective moment in which we've decided that standing with Ukraine is important precisely because we have no stakes. In other words, that for once in our life, we've decided as a country and as a region in the world to stand with a nation in which we have only to lose and very little to gain. And I believe that the rest of the world is watching. I believe that the global south, I believe that China, I believe that the Pacific, India, I believe that everybody is watching to see whether Europe is willing to bite the bullet for its beliefs and its value system, or whether Europe has succumbed to its own apathy and cynicism. And I truly wonder whether at this point succumbing to our own realpolitik may not hurt us more in the long term than it is to actually stand up. Now, of course, I understand the consequences of standing with Ukraine. I understand the consequences of potential NATO escalation. I understand the consequences of potential nuclear escalation. I made a list the other day in which I said to myself 5 reasons why we should not burn our fingers on Ukraine. 5 very rational reasons. 1, Russia considers nuclear capability to be part of its military doctrine. This means that Russia has incorporated so-called tactical nuclear warheads, which can be detonated practically everywhere within the European continent, and that would cause so-called small nuclear explosions. Since we have not done so, we have a nuclear umbrella which we have from the Americans in Europe, which means mutually assured destruction. There is no tactical capacity because we are not even willing to indulge the idea. In other words, a tactical nuclear strike has to either call the Western bluff or risk the annihilation of the world as we know it. A terrible scenario to be in. One good reason not to touch Ukraine. Second good reason not to touch Ukraine. Again, these are the realist options, right? Second good reason. If Ukraine falls to Russia, there's little we can do for any other country in the region other than to rapidly make it part of the European Union or part of NATO, or allow it to fall to Russia as well. Moldova, perhaps even Poland, and so on and so forth. There is no end to it. In many ways, it may be that we are already in World War III. We simply haven't realized it yet. I said there were 5 points. The third part, whilst we've announced increased military spending, we haven't actually found a way to make Europe, or especially Germany, non-reliant on Russian natural gas. The fact that the Americans intend to build 2 ports in Germany for liquid gas is laughable, considering there's no way that Germany could become quickly sustainable on that level. It could not meet its energy needs. That would be the third. The fourth one, I guess we've already conflated 3 and 4. I hate when I do numbers. But I was going through a mania about this. I've been very, very upset about this. The fourth one is the fact that Europe didn't want the Ukraine to be a part of NATO. In fact, Germany quite explicitly said, we can make the offer, but the actual realistic, 12-step plan for Ukraine to become a part of NATO is not on the table. And yet, of course, Russia was able to start this war predicated on the idea that Ukraine would become part of NATO. At the time, what was the German response, the Western response? It wasn't to say, wait a minute, we don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. The response was to double down and to say, we defend the individual sovereignty of nations to make their own decisions. Now, in hindsight, that was a terrible idea. If behind the scenes we could have reassured Russia that it wasn't going to happen, then perhaps the invasion would have occurred. I don't think that's the case, but it's possible. It's like people who say, well, maybe if the nuclear bomb had been demonstrated rather than used, it would have been just as effective. But it does mean that Europe's desire to integrate other countries into NATO, not just Europe, but NATO itself, is a newfound desire, a desire that has come about through this very conflict. And so we're already finding ourselves in the dominoes, not just of escalation, but of doubling down on our own position. What I'm trying to say, and I know I'm not being very eloquent here, but what I'm trying to say is that the wheels of history are already in motion. And that choosing not to act at this point is not the same thing as pulling a brake. We have set events in motion that cannot be reversed. They can be slowed down, but they cannot be undone. And of course, when I say we have to say that Russia has done this. It is not an over-exaggeration to say that the world as we knew it 2 weeks ago is no longer the world that we live in today. It's not an exaggeration to say that we may find ourselves, ironically, being the generation of irony, in a world conflict in which we have to choose whether or not we actually believe in freedom and democracy. And perhaps we don't. And perhaps this is a slow, necessary, tragic unfolding of a realignment of the geopolitical security order as we knew it. Perhaps we will become more nationalistic, more economically isolated. Perhaps we will start restricting our own liberties, our own beliefs, our own ideals on behalf of access to a global consumer market. And yet what makes me hopeful is that within the past week, we've bitten a lot of bullets already. For example, the financial sanctions we put on Russia are not only devastating for the Russian people, they're going to have consequences for the international economy. Not only in the Middle East, not only in Africa, but also very much in the West. Perhaps not equally, but to a certain extent, it's true. The belief in the idea of a neoliberal order in which trade was a way to avoid conflict has been shattered overnight. Of course, for educated listeners like yourselves, this myth had always been broken, like all myths. It was sustained by faith alone. But at the same time, we found a willingness and a capacity for Western leaders to coordinate, to take sanctions that are not necessarily in their own best interest, to wage what is essentially a proxy war in Ukraine, to weaponize Ukrainians, to say that Ukraine matters not because we have stakes, but because Ukraine defines what the stakes are. And that's a very powerful thing. It means that there's an opportunity to re-envision what it means to be a citizen of the West. And I don't want to replace and substitute my cynicism for an unfounded idealism, which would be an equally tragic mistake. But instead I want to say, and I want to say to you, as citizens of the world, that right now there is a vacuum of meaning in the world, an opportunity that should not be missed to frame the value system and the beliefs that we would like to see for our world in the future. That what has happened amidst both the dual pandemic of COVID and the invasion of Ukraine is that we find ourselves in a liminal moment in which the future is, as of yet, completely open. And we are faced with the immediate and very exacting responsibility of asking ourselves the existential question, what does it mean if we really believe in the idea of democracy and freedom in the West? And do we have it in us to forego our cynicism, to forego our idealism, which are attached at the hip? It's easy to be a cynic if you're an idealist, in the same manner that it's easy to be idealistic if you have a cynical detachment. And to engage in the very painful decision of how much are we willing to endure in order to sustain the world that we would like to see? Because the one thing we know for certain, and I don't want you to think that I'm just preaching from privilege here, because all preaching is from privilege, that the world as we know it is not sustainable, that we will have to make sacrifices. And the question right now is, do we ask and demand of Ukrainians to sacrifice for us? Or do we find a way in which we find it in us to see in Ukraine's suffering a collective refocusing of that which we think is worth suffering for? And that is up to us. And I know that's abstract, but I think it's incredibly important that we don't succumb to a kind of apathy and nihilism and a cynical retreat into the vestiges of what remains of our comfort as we watch the rest of the world slowly crumble. I do think that there is a moment right now to envision a different world and to understand that freedom and democracy were never abstract concepts that came to people in the dead of night. but that at every corner, every advancement, every leftist emancipation, every struggle, everything we have done to protect and enshrine the ideals of the kind of world we'd like to live in, if done sincerely, has been a fight, has been a struggle. The only kind of democracy that comes free is the kind of democracy that is one in name only. And that everything that we experience as freedom, as a civic liberty, as a right, was hard fought. That we cannot take any of it for granted. We can't take the vote for granted. We can't take our civic liberties for granted. We can't take our freedom and our freedom of speech for granted. That these things have to be fought for. And to fight for something isn't the same thing as fighting against something. And what makes me proud is that within the past 2 weeks, within the so-called West, we've identified not just something worth fighting against, but something worth fighting for. And that if we are fighting for the Ukrainian people, we are also fighting for what it means to be a free citizen in the West. And I think that's very important. So, that is it. That was terrible, wasn't it?
No, I think it's really difficult to articulate these positions, but I think it's so important to talk about cynicism, and I think you're right to point out ways in which it is generational.
It's difficult for me, and we can talk more about this in the Discord, because we're going to do a Q&A in the Discord, but what's difficult for me is that I am so resoundingly anti-imperial and pacifist that I find it very, very difficult to say that we have to stand for something. And yet part of what I find beautiful about Ukraine is that to stand with Ukraine is to stand for a country in which we have no stakes. And that is the ultimate stake. That is the fight.
Ukraine is the stake.
That is the fight worth fighting. The country in which we have no interests is our interest.
Yes.
That is. So thank you guys so much for watching today. I really, really appreciate it. I really enjoyed being here with you this morning. Thank you to everybody joining from around the world. I know these are challenging times, difficult times. I appreciate and I'm grateful for the fact that you have treated us with such generosity, with such intellectual kinship and kindness. And thank you to Jeneline for editing and posting all of these lectures. Yeah. That is a lot of work and a lot of labor. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of everybody. Sure. Thank you on behalf of our patrons.
It's my joy.
And we're going to be taking a 5-minute break, and then we're going to host a Q&A on Patreon, which we're also going to record as a podcast.
Yes.
That podcast is exclusively for patrons. It's where we can kind of speak off the cuff, hot mic. And we will continue to try to hopefully engage in this conversation with you, try to find some form. I'm very conservative here. I'm an apologist for the Enlightenment. I know that Adorno and Horkheimer are anti-Enlightenment, but I think that we should continue to, in these incredibly vulgar times, try to shine a light and find grace within our collective community of thought. So thank you guys so much.
And we think that's really what this project is all about. And that's why we want to make these classes available for you, because we think that your time is precious. We think that you're precious. And we want to make sure that this stuff is, these classes aren't going anywhere. So thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, I want to echo that actually and affirm it, which is that there are moments in which we feel profoundly overwhelmed by the fact that this is real. That this is not, to us it doesn't feel real. But when we get messages from Ukrainian students, we feel, I don't know what we feel. We feel too much to put into words. And it is, I genuinely believe that being a critical individual thinker, capable of finding empathy and sincerity in thought, is not only a responsibility but a gift. And that the world is a world that in its darkness still has light if we don't turn away from critically engaging with it. That is my only solace. I don't understand why anybody would want to live in this world unless it is through the collective community of thought. I see that in artists who make music, I see that in artists who paint, I see that in writers who write, and hopefully with you, you find solace in what I hope is a genuine, sincere exchange of that which is most personal to me, which is what goes on in my head. So, thank you guys, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
And see you next week.
Bye-bye.